Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Holocaust survivors. For in a sense, every Jewish person is a Holocaust survivor. I heard this from somebody who was in Auschwitz and pointed out that each and every one of us was targeted for potential elimination in those dark years not so long ago. And tragically, the appropriate lessons have not yet been learned fully by the world. We have with us today one of the world's leading battlers against this shameful phenomenon of Holocaust denial, Professor Deborah Lipstadt. I am reminded of the late Menachem Perlmutter, an Auschwitz alumnus, a devoted friend and advocate of Ben-Gurion University and the Negev, who traveled all over the world promoting Israel, the Negev, and Ben-Gurion University, who related that he was often criticized by some non-Jews for the so-called harping about the events that happened 40 to 50 years ago. His classic telling comeback was, look, Jews allegedly killed one person some 2,000 years ago, and the Christian world has not let them forget this so-called event. And you expect me to forget the murder of 6 million Jews in my own lifetime? Today, we'll have the honor of hearing from one of the world's greatest fighters against the crime of Holocaust denial, Professor Deborah Lipstadt, the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. Deborah, as I knew her literally from her childhood days, was raised in a home steeped with Judaism and service to the community. In 1986, her first book was called Beyond Belief. It examined how the United States press reported the persecution of European Jewry during World War II. Her research showed a shocking revelation that in contrast to popular belief, so much actually was known in real time, but simply was not believed, beyond belief. In 1993, she published another revealing book, this time exposing the phenomenon of Holocaust denial in all of its ugly manifestations and disguises. David Irving, a self-appointed historian, was exposed by Professor Lipstadt as an anti-Semitic Hitler admirer and Holocaust denier. He sued her for libel in the United Kingdom, a site which seemed favorable for success in such a suit. But he didn't know with whom he had picked a fight. Israelis believe that people with red hair, like that possessed by Deborah, are called gingies and have fiery personalities to match their hair. Irving lost the battle decisively in a much publicized trial. As the Times of London said, history has had its day in court and scored a crushing victory in a 300-plus page historic decision. Deborah Lipstadt justifiably became a Jewish heroine, a public speaker in great demand as a spokesman for the Jewish people and for historic truth. She has since won innumerable awards, received several honorary doctorates, and has continued her outstanding writing, teaching, and public involvement. Her most recent just-published book on the Eichmann trial has won wide acclaim, and we are thrilled to have her here today to provide us with some historic perspective on this important trial. It is fitting that she has been chosen to deliver the annual Irene and Hyman Kreitman lecture. I had known Irene and Hyman ever since I arrived at Ben-Gurion University in 1974, and my wife and I had the pleasure of hosting them in our home, and I thought I knew all about them. But in preparing for this talk today and reviewing the Kreitman relationship with Ben-Gurion University, even I was blown away at the large number of projects in which they were involved. It was just mind-boggling. There were close to 40 different projects over the years in every single aspect of Ben-Gurion University: buildings, chairs, research, scholarships, every aspect of Ben-Gurion. They loved Ben-Gurion University and left their mark on every aspect of the university. It's also appropriate as well that I acknowledge the presence of Dame Shirley Porter, the sister of the late Irene Kreitman. Welcome. It is customary and indeed obligatory for public speakers to reveal any possible conflicts of interest that may influence their presentation. I must proudly confess that Professor Deborah Lipstadt is my first cousin. She represents a major fringe benefit which I acquired when I married my wonderful wife of over half a century. I am proud and honored to introduce to you that great, feisty Jewish historian and truth defender, Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. What Professor Glick, or Shimon, or Shimon, as some of us still call him, neglected to mention is that I was also a flower girl at his wedding. So I'm the only one in the room who can claim that credit. אני אתחיל בכמה מילים בעברית. אני מבקשת סליחה שאני אדבר, ההרצאה שלי יהיה באנגלית. יש איזושהי אירוניה שאני מדברת על משפט שנוהל בעברית, והיו כאלה שביקרו את זה ואמרו, זה היה צריך להיות, חנה ארנדט אחד מהם, היה צריך להיות בגרמנית, כי כל הפרינסיפלס, השופטים, היה, patience, דיברו גרמנית, אבל בן-גוריון עמד על זה, זה משפט שבית משפט ישראלי, וזה צריך להיות בעברית. אז אני מקווה שפעם הבאה שאני אבוא לבן-גוריון, אני אוכל לדבר בעברית. Thank you all for having me. I want to pay particular thanks to Professor Carmi. I looked over the list of people who have given this lecture before and the list of people who are not only receiving Torei Kavod honorary degrees this evening, but in the past, and the only way to respond to that is to say katonti, and to thank you for this honor. The impact of the Eichmann trial is far greater than the fact that Adolf Eichmann, a major operator and facilitator, but not the chief executive officer of the final solution, was brought to justice. The effect of this trial can be felt in many different spheres. At the same time, it should be noted that there are certain things the trial didn't do, though it's often credited with having done. As is the case with most historical events, many of the changes wrought by the Eichmann trial were neither sudden nor entirely new. Many were part of a larger, more protracted process. The trial simply accelerated the process of change. Let us look, for example, at the use of the word Holocaust. Some people claim that it's first used at the trial. In fact, if you look at the English translation, the official English translation of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, the word Holocaust appears there in relation to the final solution. But the Eichmann trial did help render the word Holocaust as the term for this event, as opposed to the word Churban or Shoah. By the late 1970s, the word Holocaust had become the common nomenclature for the final solution. But this process was accelerated, certainly, by the Eichmann trial. The trial did not just help to wed now a universally known name or term to this event, but it accelerated a fledgling field of study. After the trial, additional scholars began to explore the event. In fact, if you look at Raoul Hilberg's memoir, Raoul Hilberg being one of the deans of the first people to do a tremendously in-depth, authoritative history of certainly the perpetrators, when he presented his idea at Columbia University before the trial, in the 50s, that he wanted to work on this topic, he was told by his professors that he was signing his academic death warrant because nobody was really interested in this topic. Another change that came about as a result of the trial was a tremendous increase in the number of memoirs. Holocaust survivors had been speaking about what had happened to them before. Many people like to say that they were silent before and afterwards they began to speak. They had been speaking before, but many more spoke afterwards. Some had been writing their memoirs. In fact, Yad Vashem notes that before the trial there were some memoirs written. After the trial there were many more memoirs written. Of course, in subsequent years there were even more, not just because of the trial, but because survivors became older and older. When you are older, you're more established, you're more likely to be writing memoirs than when you're younger and rebuilding your life. The trial also had a significant impact in Germany. Since in the aftermath of the trial, a German Ministry of Justice official, in an oblique reference to his country's somewhat anemic, and that's putting it kindly, a record of pursuing war criminals, noted an avalanche of prosecutions will now follow. Germany had been very, very lackadaisical in prosecuting war criminals. Prosecutions followed. There was hardly an avalanche, but there were many more than had been the case before. The Eichmann trial was also responsible, at least in some measure, in convincing the German government to reverse its opposition to extending the statute of limitations and ultimately eliminating any statute of limitations on the crime of genocide. Many of you may not remember, may not know that there was it would have come about in the mid to late 60s, I believe, that there would have been a statute of limitation on any prosecution of war criminals. And the Eichmann trial helped generate the opposition to that. From a legal perspective, the trial reinforced the notion that there is universal jurisdiction over genocide and crimes against humanity. While legal scholars differed then and continue to differ over whether Israel had legitimate jurisdiction over Eichmann, there is now a consensus amongst democratic states that genocidal killers cannot take refuge behind the claims of obedience to superior orders. This notion was, of course, fundamental to the Nuremberg tribunals, but it was given additional standing by the Eichmann trial. Now, there's certain things the trial didn't do, and I think it's also important to recognize that. There was, as I referred to earlier, but just to touch on it in greater depth for a moment, there's a general perception that before the trial, nobody spoke about the Holocaust, and after the trial, survivors began to speak about the Holocaust. Actually, that's not true. There was in 1956, in the Yom HaShoah commemoration here in Israel, 40,000 people participated. That's quite a number. Now, of course, most of those were survivors and their families, but still, that's not nobody speaking about it. People spoke. I think the differences in my main argument will be today, people spoke, but the world didn't listen. And what happened as a result of the Eichmann trial is people began to listen. Similar claims have been made about America, that it wasn't until the Six-Day War that people began to talk about the Holocaust. Again, there was discussion before, but accelerated by the trial. Now, one need only look at events on the Israeli political agenda in the 1950s, again, to shed doubt on the idea that there was no conversation in this country about the Holocaust. There was a great deal of conversation. Let me just tick it off. In 1950, the Knesset passed the law for the prosecution of Nazis and their collaborators. It was under that law, that Eichmann was prosecuted. Now, you might ask, why was the Knesset passing this law in the 1950s? It didn't expect any Nazi war criminals to show up at Lud, or the airport was then called, or in Haifa at the port and say, prosecute me. What had happened was that survivors were on the streets of Jerusalem, on the beach at Tel Aviv, in the market at Haifa, wherever it might be, and they would see someone and they'd say, that person was the capo in my barracks. That person turned me in. And survivors came to the Knesset and pushed for a bill that would give them the ability, some mechanism to bring charges against these people, and hence that law. And the idea of against Nazis and their collaborators was also to bring Israeli law into consort with other laws in other nations on the prosecution of war criminals. This, as I said, this law, 1950 law, was the law under which Eichmann was prosecuted and which Dumyaniuk was also prosecuted. In 1954, there was great discussion about the revolving around the Kastner trial, which many of you may be familiar with. Kastner was the Jew who negotiated with Eichmann trucks for lives, as Yehuda Bauer has termed it and others have termed it. And he was, of course, sued for libel. He sued for libel. He sued a Hungarian Jew, Mikhail Grunwald, for libel for having called him a collaborator who collaborated with Eichmann. Shortly, he lost the trial, and in 1957 he was assassinated outside his home in Tel Aviv. Not long thereafter, Beit Mishpat Elyon, the High Court, reversed his loss of the trial, but nonetheless there was great discussion about that. There was a debate in this country about what to call Yom HaShoah. Amongst the suggestions were Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, Yom HaShoah I forget how it went exactly in Hebrew, but in the English, a Holocaust Uprising and Bravery Remembrance Day. I'm sure in the Hebrew it's as equally forgettable as the term in English. It eventually became Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. Discussions centered in the 1950s about the creation of Yad Vashem. What should Yad Vashem be? Some professors at the Hebrew University wanted it to be a strictly academic entity that would investigate the existence of anti-Semitism. Survivors, including some who were employed by Yad Vashem, wanted to be a place for collecting memoirs, for collecting first-hand testimonies, and there were very bitter fights which spilled over into the press. And of course, in the 1950s, there was the struggle led in Maine by Menachem Begin, though certainly not alone, against accepting kesef damim, as they called it, or blood money, which the more neutral term shilumim, reparations from Germany. At one point in this controversy, it almost threatened Ben-Gurion's the Labor government, when 15,000 Israelis gathered to protest the acceptance of reparations. In the early 60s, again, before the Eichmann trial, in March 1960, so it's 4 or 5 months, it's 2 months before Eichmann is captured, there was great debate in this country about the meeting at the New York's Waldorf Astoria during the session of the United Nations when Prime Minister Ben-Gurion met with Konrad Adenauer. Many people felt it's too early, it's too soon for these meetings to take place, much less for there to be any sense of rapprochement. Then, of course, there was Israel's tremendous need for weapons during this period, and the one country that was most willing to supply them to Israel was Germany. The irony of this negotiation was that it was conducted on behalf of Germany by Adenauer's chief of staff, a man named Hans Globke. And Globke, if some of you are here, some Holocaust scholars or students of the Holocaust are here, you know that Globke was the man who was responsible for writing the Nuremberg laws. He didn't come up with the idea, but he wrote the details of the Nuremberg laws. And more than that, later in the 1930s, when the Nazis proclaimed that every Jew had to take a woman had to have Sarah as her middle name, a man had to have Isaac as his middle name, so that they would be immediately recognizable as Jewish. Certain people were exempt from that. Certain Jews were exempt from that if they had identifiably Jewish names. And Globke was the man who made up the list of the identifiably Jewish names. So you imagine him sitting in his study saying, okay, Mendele, that's Jewish enough, but Menachem is not, or whatever it might be. He goes on to become Adenauer's chief of staff. He's the one who conducts the negotiations with Israel on behalf of procurement of weapons. And in fact, Ben-Gurion said he was very forthcoming in negotiating. So the Holocaust is not absent from the agenda in this country when the Eichmann trial begins. It's not absent from the agenda in my country. You have various movies like Judgment at Nuremberg. You have more what we call in somewhat cultural slang cheesy presentations on American quiz shows and This Is Your Life. If any of you have roots back in America, you may remember this, where Holocaust survivors would be profiled. There were books, The Wall, by the Diary of Anne Frank, Mila 18, and of course Exodus. So by the time of the Eichmann trial, the Diary of Anne Frank was a bestseller with a highly successful Broadway production and high-powered Hollywood film, a film that, of course, de-Judaizes in many respects the Holocaust, but nonetheless addresses it. So we're presented with a conundrum. Why, if there was so much discussion of the Holocaust, if books on the Holocaust were bestsellers, why is there a common perception, and it is a very common perception, I came into it in so many places as I was writing my book on the Holocaust, that the Eichmann trial changes everything, that people begin to speak as a result of the Eichmann trial. Even people such as Chaim Guri, who covered, Israel poet, journalist, who covered the trial, wrote a wonderful series of articles which have been produced as a book in Hebrew and then translated into an English book as well, who covered the trial, talked about the trial creating a major upheaval. Or why was the editorial board of Davar, then one of the leading Israeli newspapers, amazed by what it heard at the trial? Why was Natan Alterman, one of Israel's, already in 1961, an Israeli national icon, beset by what he described as a sudden and clear realization of what had happened? If you have all this discussion, if you have these laws, if you have these debates, if you have these trials, these events taking place, what is it that happens? Now, someone who had their head in the sand and never listened to the news or read the newspaper or anything, which was almost weird not to do in Israel, but even so, would say, I didn't know anything about it, it's one thing. But when Chaim Guri and Natan Alterman and the editorial board at Davar are saying something changes as the result of the trial, something has happened here. There was some change, but it may not have been the change that we often think was the case. Similar, in fact, one of the people who also commented on the change was Israeli High Court Justice, the late Moshe Beisky, who was a witness in the trial. In the 1990s, in an interview for PBS, Public Broadcasting System in the United States, Beisky talked about the great changes that resulted in Israel as a result of the trial. Yisrael Gutman, Professor Yisrael Gutman, the Hebrew University, who was also a witness at the trial, was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, also insisted that the trial changed things in Israel. So if there had been so much attention to the Holocaust in the 1950s, why did these astute, well-connected observers believe that the trial had such an impact and opened previously unexplored vistas regarding an awareness of the Holocaust? Why were so many foreign reporters? In fact, there were more foreign reporters in Jerusalem on the opening day of the trial, which was one day before Yuri Gagarin was shot into space and about a week before the Bay of Pigs, the invasion, just to give you some sort of context. But there were more foreign reporters in Jerusalem at the opening of the Eichmann trial than had been in Nuremberg. Now, of course, Nuremberg took place immediately after World War II. Europe was shattered. People were focused on other things. There are many, many ostensible differences, yet nonetheless, something had happened here that had changed things. Above all, maybe the biggest element to add to our conundrum is, if there was so much attention to the Holocaust, why did prosecutor Gideon Hausner feel compelled to bring the story of the tragedy to the world? Why did he feel that both in Israel and outside of it there had been insufficient attention to the topic? If survivors were so commonly heard from, if there was so much connection, why did Hausner feel it imperative to make survivors and their stories, even when the survivors had no connection to Adolf Eichmann, central to his case? Let me offer some possible explanations. Certainly, one of the obvious things is during the trial, Hausner calls 104 witnesses. The vast majority, I think 90, I forget the exact number, but 95, 96 are survivors of the Holocaust. So it's the first time there is concentrated attention. And it's one thing to hear the story bits and pieces, po vasham, as you might say, here and there, but it's another thing to hear it in a concentrated fashion. And Hausner in a decision that bothered the judges tremendously, not just Hannah Arendt, but bothered the judges tremendously, chose to tell the story of the Shoah from the beginning to the end. If anybody gets beaten up in this trial, it's Hausner by the judges. They are very critical of him for doing this and bringing what they think is ancillary information that is not directly connected to Eichmann's activities. So the concentrated information certainly plays a role. In retrospect, when one compares the degree of attention given to the Holocaust prior to the trial and given to it at the time of the trial, the pre-trial conversation certainly seems far more paltry. So this is a partial explanation, but I don't think it's a sufficient explanation. The change between the conversation which preceded the trial and the one that follows it relates directly to survivor testimony, and that's another reason why I was so touched by Shimon opening in his introduction in a comment that of Holocaust survivors, in the sense that certainly Jews and even amongst some non-Jews, we are to some degree survivors after the Holocaust. Never had there been such a steady stream of survivors, this close to 100 survivors, telling their story. Their testimony regarding what happened to them turned the tragedy of European Jewry, in the words of Moshe Shamir, the novelist and then the literary editor of Ma'ariv, turned the Holocaust into a personal moral problem. People spoke in the first person singular. This was my story, and this is what happened to me. And that impact, the concentration and that first person singular, certainly had an impact. It did what Moshe Shamir described as abstract knowledge became real, and history was turned into collective memory. It was heard anew. It was not the telling which was new, but the hearing which was new. The information and consciousness of this event seeped into the world's, and even more so, into Jews' consciousness in an unprecedented fashion. Now, let me be careful not to overstate the case. Even though the trial made people become decidedly more aware of events regarding the Holocaust, it would take years for the public to fully grasp its dimensions. Nor can one discount the impact of knowledge of the Holocaust and recognition of the Holocaust and facing the Holocaust. That certainly Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, I think had a tremendous impact in that regard, in both here and in the diaspora. The Six-Day War, to some degree, and having been here during the Six-Day War, as a very small child, to some degree gave people the sense that Mitzada lo tipol shenit, Mitzada would not fall again. The Yom Kippur War, just a few short years later, reminded people just how vulnerable the Jewish state was still. The Jewish state was still quite vulnerable. The trial also helped foster a different perception of the victims, particularly in this country. Previously, the prevailing popular impression had been, not just in Israel, but certainly in Israel, that the victims had gone, to use a term coined by Abba Kovner, and he was always sorry that he did, katzon latevach, like sheep to the slaughter. Abba Kovner, the poet, the resistance fighter, the kibbutznik, and from the Israeli perspective, Alamailis, a man of the literary pen, a fighter, and a man of the soil, was the first person, not the first Jew, but the first person in Europe to call for armed uprising against the Germans. And in that call for armed uprising, he said, Lo nelech katzon latevach. What happened at the trial was that when Kovner and other resistance fighters came to give testimony, many people thought that this, certainly Israelis, the courtroom, which had been less packed in the days before, and Kol Yisrael had stopped giving wall-to-wall coverage, suddenly started to give it again, because everybody said, now will come the moment of good news, now will come the moment of uplift, now we will hear the stories of the fighters. And what I found so compelling, not just in Kovner, but in Sylvia Lubetka Zuckerman and Antik Zuckerman, the Warsaw Ghetto fighters, and other fighters, every fighter who gave testimony, but Kovner most dramatically said, there's a question hovering over this courtroom. Why did more people not fight back? And he said, I protest against this question with all my heart. The question to be asked is, how was it possible there was any resistance at all? And when Sylvia Lubetka Zuckerman gave her testimony, she talked about the bravery in the Warsaw Ghetto, but she wasn't talking about the uprising. She talked about the fact how when the ghetto was first established, the consensus amongst Jews in the ghetto was that the Germans were going to turn Jews, they said it's forbidden to educate children, and they said their objective is to turn us into peasants, into slaves, into uneducated people. And we nonetheless risked our lives to educate our children. That's the bravery she pointed at, not the uprising, which she could have easily have spoken of in a personal way. In 1962, one Israeli teacher may well have put it best when she wrote that the root of the different reactions of native-born Israelis when they were subjected to attack by 5 Arab nations in 1948 and the reactions of the victims of the Holocaust is not a result of differences in their inherent characteristics or personality, but in the here and there. In other words, the survivors of or the victims of the Shoah were chronologically and geographically challenged. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Citing this, I want to pay tribute, I don't know if she's here, to Professor Chania Blanco, whose work on Israel's reaction to the Holocaust has been so important to helping me formulate my opinions as well. Chaim Guri made the same point when he covered the trial, as I said, on a daily basis. He said, far be it from me to blur the distinction between one who dies without putting up a fight and one who fights back or tries to fight back. Because a person who loves life will by very nature always prefer those who try to extract the highest possible price of their own lives. But we must ask the forgiveness of the multitudes whom we have often judged in our hearts, we who were outside that circle. And we often judge them without asking ourselves what right we had to do so. In this country, many scholars believe, and I think it's absolutely correct, that the trial began not immediately and not overnight, but began a different perception of the victims of the Holocaust, a kinder perception. When people sat in that room or watched the televised, not televised in this country, but they were played in the movie theaters, saw the victims testifying, they didn't see, and I'll use a disparaging term, but that's the term that was used, they didn't see ghetto Jews, they didn't see shtetl Jews, they didn't see cowering Jews. They saw young men and women in their 30s and 40s, brave people who faced overwhelming odds. As Shaul Friedlander, in his magnificent book on the years of extermination, on the history of the 1941 to 45, writes that in no organization, no institution, no religious group, no scholarly group, no professional group, not one entity in Europe came to the defense of the Jews in that period. So to blame the victims is certainly a ludicrous thing to do. And Hausner, Prosecutor Hausner, who was often criticized because he seemed to show this sort of sentiment of, why didn't you fight back? My sense about Hausner is after having read the Nuremberg documents, having spoken with these survivors, understood the overwhelming odds that they faced. And he wanted to use the trial to show that to the new generation of Israelis. And it was exemplified. I just want to cite one small portion of the testimony when Moshe Beisky, who was then, who goes on, as I said, to be a high court justice, but was then a magistrate in Tel Aviv, comes to give testimony. Now, Beisky was very much admired because he had a number of opportunities, particularly one to escape from camp. He was in Plaszow, the labor camp right outside of Krakow. I hate to use this as a guiding point, but if you saw Schindler's List, that's the labor camp. We should know it anyway, but that's the labor camp that is depicted there. But Beisky did not escape because he knew that if he escaped, Amnon Goth, the commandant of the camp, would have murdered the 80 other men in his barracks. So he stayed. Beisky comes into the courtroom and he goes into the witness box, and Moshe Landau, the chief judge, the presiding judge, Moshe Landau, who died exactly a year ago, says to Beisky, "You may sit." And Beisky says, "No, I prefer to stand." He's a man of the court. He wants to give the court, this is a momentous event, and he wants to stand. And he gives and he testifies not in complete sentences, but in complete paragraphs. He is articulate, he is composed, he talks about horrible things in the most forensic, legal way of doing it, and in a very, very comprehensive way. And he's telling the story how, and Plaszow, at one point, 15,000 Jews were forced to stand at attention with a couple of hundred guards around them when a young child was brought out to be hung. And they're standing there watching, the rope breaks and the rope. It's a horrible scene. And Beisky is describing this when in the middle of a sentence, Hausner pounces and he says, 15,000 people, around them just a couple of hundred guards. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you do something? And Beisky, suddenly the complete sentences are gone. And whether you read it in the Hebrew, the English translation, whatever, he says this was already in the third year of the war. And the court reporters put in ellipses, ... to show that they haven't lost the end of the sentence, but that he didn't finish his sentence. Nevertheless, there was still hope. Here were people working on forced labor. They apparently needed this work, possibly, maybe. Then he stops, and he turns to Moshe Landau, and he says, "May I sit?" And he sits down and he says, "I cannot describe this terror-inspiring fear. Nearby us, there was a Polish camp. There were 1,000 Poles. 100 meters beyond the camp, they had a place to go to, their homes. I don't recall one instance of escape on the part of the Poles. But where could any of the Jews go? We were wearing clothes which were dyed yellow with yellow stripes. In the center of our head, they made a kind of swath in a strip of 4 centimeters in width. And even at that moment, let us suppose that 15,000 people within the camp even succeeded without arm strength to go beyond the boundaries of the camp. Where would they go? What could they do?" And there were other moments like that. Hausner was not asking, and when Hausner pounced, and he's heavily criticized for it by many people, feeling an insensitivity to the survivors. I think he understood what they had gone through, and he wanted to impress upon young Israelis that the difference between these quote-unquote diaspora Jews and the new Israeli Jew was simply a matter of, as I said earlier, the here and the there. He had come to know them, and he understood what they had faced. So this trial brings together many different developments. And it accelerates many developments, which I think help and begin to shape the way we perceive of the Shoah today. In the United States, certainly there was a different way of perceiving the victims of the Shoah after this. Again, slowly, it took a while, but it changed. Those of you who may remember in the United States, they were not called survivors in the 50s and even in the early 60s. They were called refugees. There's a very different connotation to being a survivor and being a refugee. fact of the matter, I think, is that in this trial, we saw the story of the Shoah being laid out for the world in a most comprehensive fashion. And again, we saw the world listening in a way that it had not listened before. Allow me to end with something that I learned recently. And in fact, if you go to YouTube, many of the clips of the trial, this was the first trial ever to be televised. It was filmed each night. It was not shown here in Israel because there was no Israeli television, though I do have friends who were in Israel at the time who swear they saw it on television. When you point out to them there was no Israeli television, no, but they put it up. I said, no, they didn't, because there's such a perception. Memory is a funny thing. But if you look at the clips, you'll see this is true. On the opening first moment of the trial, you can see the opening, the courtroom fills up. Eichmann is brought into the famous glass booth without any announcement. People look up and they see a man who looks more like an accountant than someone who had masterminded or organized, not masterminded, but organized the killing of the Jews. And then the usher, as we would call him, the bailiff, comes out from the side and he yells, Beit HaMishpat, which, as you well know, many in this room know, is the Israeli equivalent of all rise. And everybody stands. And everybody in that room is looking at the judges, except for one person. And I didn't notice this till he told me this, and that's Gabi Bach, who was Gideon Hausner's assistant, who also goes on to a very distinguished career on the High Court. And Gabi Bach told me not long ago, when we were at a conference together, Judge Bach told me that he had been the official advisor to Bureau 6, the police bureau, which questioned Eichmann. So he saw Eichmann very often in the year before the trial. He saw him every day during the trial. But the most powerful moment of that 2-year period, when he was almost in daily contact with Eichmann or saw him on a daily basis, was at that moment. And if you look, you'll see everyone's looking at the judge, but Gabi Bach is looking at Eichmann. And he said, to see Adolf Eichmann standing at attention before 3 judges of the state of Israel and the symbol of the state of Israel was enough for him. And it reminded me of something I learned, in fact, from Professor Jablonka's book, of a story which appeared in the, shall we say, profoundly secular, I sometimes call it Haredi secular, newspaper Ma'ariv, on the day Eichmann was captured. It headlined the stories, Keal Nekamot Hofia, the god of retribution has appeared. The fact that this man, who had been one of the people most responsible for the carrying out of the Shoah, was standing at attention before these judges and the symbol of the state of Israel was enough to say all else that follows is a footnote. This is the moment for which he had been waiting. Thank you very much. Thank you.